David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 10, I Become Neglected and Am Provided For. The first act of business Mr. Murdstone performed when the day of the solemnity was over, and light was freely admitted into the house, was to give Peggotty a month's warning. Much as Peggotty would have disliked such a service, I believe she would have retained it, for my sake, in preference to the best upon earth. She told me we must part, and told me why, and we condoled with one another in all sincerity. Peggotty went on to say, "I'm a-going, Davy, you see, to my brother's first for another fortnight's visit, just till I have had time to look about me and get to be something like myself again. Now I've been thinking that perhaps if they don't want you here at present, you might be let to go along with me." The idea of being surrounded by those honest faces made a calm in my heart. It was ruffled next moment, to be sure, by a doubt of Miss Murdstone giving her consent. And even that was set at rest soon, for she came out to take an evening grope in the store closet while we were yet in conversation, and Peggotty, with a boldness that amazed me, broached the topic on the spot. "The boy will be idle there," said Miss Murdstone, looking into a pickle jar, "and idleness is the root of all evil, but to be sure he would be idle here or anywhere, in my opinion." Peggotty had an answer ready, I could see, but she swallowed it for my sake and remained silent. Peggotty had an angry answer ready, I could see, but she swallowed it for my sake and remained silent. Said Miss Murdstone, still keeping her eye on the pickles. "It is of more importance than anything else. It is of paramount importance that my brother should not be disturbed or made uncomfortable. I suppose I had better say yes." I thanked her without making any demonstration of joy, lest it should induce her to withdraw her consent. However, the permission was given, and was never retracted, for when the month was out, Peggotty and I were ready to depart. Mr. Barkis came into the house for Peggotty's boxes. Peggotty was naturally in low spirits at leaving what had been her home so many years, and where the two strong attachments of her life for my mother and myself had been formed, and she got into the cart and sat in it with her handkerchief at her eyes. So long as she remained in this condition, Mr. Barkis gave no sign of life whatever. He sat in his usual place and attitude, like a great stuffed figure. But when she began to look about her and to speak to me, he nodded his head and grinned several times. I have not the least notion at whom or what he meant by it. "It's a beautiful day, Mr. Barkis," I said as an act of politeness. "It ain't bad," said Mr. Barkis, who generally qualified his speech and rarely committed himself. "Peggotty is quite comfortable now, Mr. Barkis," I remarked for his satisfaction. "Is she, though?" said Mr. Barkis. After reflecting about it with a sagacious air, Mr. Barkis eyed her and said, Are you pretty comfortable?" Peggotty laughed and answered in affirmation. "Really and truly, you know, are you?" growled Mr. Barkis, sliding nearer to her on the seat and nudging her with his elbow. "Are you really and truly pretty comfortable, are you, eh?" And at each of these inquiries, Mr. Barkis shuffled nearer to her and gave her another nudge, so that at last we were all crowded together in the left-hand corner of the cart, and I was so squeezed that I could hardly bear it, Peggotty calling his attention to my sufferings. Mr. Barkis gave me a little more room at once, and got away by degrees. But I could not help observing that he seemed to think he hit upon a wonderful expedient for expressing himself in a neat, agreeable, and pointed manner, without the inconvenience of inventing conversation. He manifestly chuckled over it for some time. By and by he turned to Peggotty again, and repeating, "Are you pretty comfortable, though?" bore down upon us as before until the breath was nearly wedged out of my body. Mr. Peggotty and Ham waited for us at the old place. They received me and Peggotty in an affectionate manner and shook hands with Mr. Barkis, who, with his hat on the very back of his head and a shamefaced leer upon his countenance, and pervading his very legs, presented but a vacant appearance. I thought. They each took one of Peggotty's trunks and we were going through when Mr. Barkis solemnly made a sign to me with his forefinger to come under the archway. "I say," growled Mr. Barkis, "it was all right." I looked up into his face and answered with an attempt to be very profound, "Oh." "It didn't come to an end there," said Mr. Barkis, nodding confidently. "It was all right." Again I answered, "Oh." "You know who was willing?" said my friend. "It was Barkis, and Barkis only." I nodded assent. "It's all right," said Mr. Barkis, shaking hands. "I'm a friend of yourn. You made it all right first. It's all right." In his attempts to be particularly lucid, Mr. Barkis was so extremely mysterious that I might have stood looking in his face for an hour, and most assuredly should have got as much information out of it as out of the face of a clock that had stopped, but for Peggotty's calling me away. Mrs. Gummidge was waiting at the door, as if she had stood there ever since, but there was no little Emily to be seen, so I asked Mr. Peggotty where she was. "She's at school, sir," said Mr. Peggotty, wiping the heat consequent on the porterage of Peggotty's box from his forehead. "She'll be home," looking at the Dutch clock, "in from 20 minutes to half an hour's time. We all of us feel the loss of her, bless ye." A figure appeared in the distance before long, and I soon knew it to be Emily, who was a little creature still in stature, though she was grown. But when she drew nearer, I saw her blue eyes looking bluer, and her dimpled face looking brighter, and her whole self prettier and gayer. A curious feeling came over me that made me pretend not to know her, and pass by as if I were looking at something a long way off. I have never done such a thing since in later life, or I am mistaken. Little Emily didn't care a bit. She saw me well enough, but instead of turning round and calling after me, ran away laughing. This obliged me to run after her, and she ran so fast that we were very near the cottage before I caught her. "Oh, it's you, is it?" said little Emily. "Why, you knew who it was, Emily," said I. "And didn't you know who it was?" said Emily. I was going to kiss her, but she covered her cherry lips with her hands and said she wasn't a baby now, and ran away, laughing more than ever, into the house. She seemed to delight in teasing me, which was a change in her I wondered at very much. The tea-table was ready, and our little locker was put out in its old place, but instead of coming to sit by me, she went and bestowed her company upon the grumbling Mrs. Gummidge, and on Peggotty, inquiring why, and on Mr. Peggotty, inquiring why, rumpled her hair all over her face to hide it, and would do nothing but laugh. On the very first evening after our arrival, Mr. Barkis appeared in an exceedingly vacant and awkward condition, with a bundle of oranges tied up in a handkerchief. As he made no allusion of any kind to this property, he was supposed to have left it behind him by accident when he went away, until Ham, running after him to restore it, came back with the information that it was intended for Peggotty. After that occasion, he appeared every evening at exactly the same hour, and always with a little bundle, to which he never alluded, and which he regularly put behind the door and left there. These offerings of affection were of a most various and eccentric description. Among them I remember a double set of pig's trotters, a huge pin-cushion, half a bushel or so of apples, a pair of jet earrings, some Spanish onions, a box of dominoes, a canary bird, and a cage, and a leg of pickled pork. Mr. Barkis's wooing, as I remember it, was altogether of a peculiar kind. He very seldom said anything, but would sit by the fire in much the same attitude as he sat in his cart, and stare heavily at Peggotty, who was opposite. He seemed to enjoy himself very much, and not to feel at all called upon to talk. At length, when the term of my visit was nearly expired, it was given out that Peggotty and Mr. Barkis were going to make a day's holiday together, and that little Emily and I were to accompany them. I had but a broken sleep the night before, in anticipation of the pleasure of a whole day with Emily. We were all astir We were all astir betimes in the morning, and while we were yet at breakfast, Mr. Barkis appeared in the distance, driving a chaise cart toward the object of his affections. Peggotty was dressed as usual, in her neat and quiet mourning, but Mr. Barkis bloomed in a new blue coat, of which the tailor had given him such good measure, that the cuffs would have rendered gloves unnecessary in the coldest weather, while the collar was so high that it pushed his hair up on end on the top of his head. His bright buttons, too, were of the largest size, rendered complete by drab pantaloons and a buff waistcoat. I thought Mr. Barkis a phenomenon of respectability. When we were all in a bustle outside the door, I found that Mr. Peggotty was prepared with an old shoe, which was to be thrown after us for luck, and which he offered to Mrs. Gummidge for that purpose. "No, it had better be done by somebody else, Dan'l," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I'm a lone creature myself, and everythink reminds me of creatures that ain't, and everythink that reminds me of creatures that ain't lone and lorn goes contrary with me." "Come, old gal," cried Mr. Peggotty. "Take and heave it." "No, Dan'l," replied Mrs. Gummidge, whimpering and shaking her head. If I felt less, I could do no more. You don't feel like me, Dan'l. Things don't go contrary with you. No, you with them. You had better do it yourself." But here Peggotty, who had been going about from one to another in a hurried way, kissing everybody, called out from the cart in which we all were by this time, Emily and I on two little chairs side by side, that Mrs. Gummidge must do it. So Mrs. Gummidge did it, and, I am sorry to relate, cast a damp upon the festive character of our departure, by immediately bursting into tears and sinking subdued into the arms of Ham, with the declaration that she knowed she was a burden, and had better be carried to the house at once. Away we went, however, on our holiday excursion, and the first thing we did was to stop at a church, where Mr. Barkis tied the horse to some rails, and went in with Peggotty, leaving little Emily and me alone in the chaise. I took that occasion to put my arm round Emily's waist, and propose that as I was going away so very soon now, we should determine to be very affectionate to one another and very happy all day. Little Emily consenting and allowing me to kiss her, I became desperate, informing her, I recollect, that I never could love another, and that I was prepared to shed the blood of anybody who should aspire to her affections. How merry little Emily made herself about it! With what a demure assumption of being immensely older and wiser than I, the fairy little woman said I was a silly boy, and then laughed so charmingly that I forgot the pain of being called by this disparaging name in the pleasure of looking at her. Mr. Barkis and Peggotty were a good while in the church, but came out at last, and then we drove away into the country. As we were going along, Mr. Barkis turned to me and said with a wink, by the by, I should hardly have thought before that he could wink, "What name was it I wrote up in the cart?" "Clara Peggotty," I answered. "What name would it be that I should write up now?" "Clara Peggotty again," I suggested. "Clara Peggotty Barkis!" he returned, and burst into a roar of laughter that shook the chaise. In a word, they were married, and had gone into the church for no other purpose. We drove to a little inn in a by-road, where we were expected, and where we had a very comfortable dinner and passed the day with great satisfaction. Well, we came to the old boat again in good time at night, and there Mr. and Mrs. Barkis bade us good-bye and drove away snugly to their own home. A beautiful little home it was, and a little room in the roof, which the crocodile book on a shelf, with the crocodile book on a shelf by the bed's head, was to be always mine, Peggotty said, and should always be kept for me in exactly the same state. And we'll pause there.